The most dangerous thing a man can do is let someone believe they have already figured him out, not because it gives them power over him, but because the moment a person decides they know exactly what you are, they stop paying attention. They get comfortable. They start saying things out loud they would never say if they thought you were listening carefully. And a man who has spent 67 years learning how to listen carefully, a man who was trained literally by profession, to find a flaw in a structure that looks perfectly solid from the outside, that kind of man finds the comfort of underestimation to be an extraordinarily useful thing. I did not plan any of what happened on the evening of March 11th, 2023. I want to be clear about that before anything else. I am not the kind of man who engineers humiliation. I am the kind of man who shows up, does what he came to do, and lets the facts of the situation arrange themselves without his interference. The facts, in my experience, are perfectly capable of doing that without any help. My name is Gerald Patton. I am 67 years old. I live in Columbus, Ohio, on Birchwood Drive, in a 3-bedroom house that my wife Patricia and I purchased in August of 1986 for $94,500, and which I have not once seriously considered leaving. The gutters need attention about once a year. There is a crack along the left side of the driveway that I have been meaning to seal since approximately the spring of 2011, and which has become, at this point, something of a landmark. I drive a 2008 Buick LeSabre with 141,000 miles on it. Dark blue. I keep it clean. It starts every morning without complaint, which is more than I can say for a number of people I have known. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer. Before that, 2 years at a small firm in Dayton that has since closed, and before that, for years finishing my degree at Ohio State, which I paid for entirely on my own by working overnight freight at a warehouse on the west side of Columbus 3 nights a week while carrying a full course load. I am telling you this not for sympathy. I do not require any, but because the way a man pays for his own education shapes the way he thinks about everything that comes after it. You learn when you earn things the slow way, not to waste them. You learn precision. You learn patience. You learn that structures, building, finances, families, careers, do not fail all at once. They fail incrementally, at the points where the load was never properly distributed, long before anyone can see it from the outside. I retire from full-time engineering work in 2019. I consult occasionally now. A review here, a set of eyes on a preliminary drawing there, nothing more than I choose to take on. I am not a man who needs to be busy to feel like himself. I have a garden in the back that produces more tomatoes than I can use every August. I have a workbench in the garage where I spend a fair amount of time on Saturday mornings. I have a standing Tuesday lunch at a diner on Broad Street that has not updated its menu since roughly 1994, and which I find deeply and genuinely comforting for exactly that reason. I tell you all of this because Simone had decided, somewhere in the first year of her marriage to my son Daniel, that she already knew what I was, and what I was in her accounting, was a quiet old man in simple clothes with a modest car and a modest house, and no particular claim on anyone's serious attention. She was not cruel about it. That is the thing I want you to understand about Simone before we go any further. She was not a cruel woman. She was a woman who made rapid, confident assessments of people and situations, and then acted entirely on those assessments, without leaving much room for revision. In a certain kind of environment, that quality looks like competence. It looks like decisiveness. It is only when the assessment is wrong that you see the shape of it clearly. Welcome, CTA. Excluded from count. My son Daniel is 41 years old. He works in commercial real estate development here in Columbus and has built, by any honest measure, a genuinely good career. I am proud of him. I want to say that directly and mean it, because this is not a story about my son's failures. Daniel is a good man. He is the kind of man who, when he finally understood what had been happening, did not deflect or rationalize. He looked at it squarely, and he said he was sorry, and he meant it. I am getting ahead of myself. But I want you to have that before we go into the harder parts. Patricia passed in October of 2017. Pancreatic cancer. 7 months from the day of diagnosis to the end, which is about as much time as that particular disease tends to give you. She was 63 years old. She had been the social architecture of our household for 34 years. The one who knew which cousin was upset about what, who kept a calendar, who remembered every birthday and every anniversary and every detail of every conversation she had ever had with anyone in our family. When she was gone, I became, for a period, very quiet. I tended my own property. I did not press myself into spaces where I was uncertain of my welcome. I missed her the way you miss a load-bearing wall, not just the presence of it, but the entire structure of the thing that depended on it being there. Daniel met Simone in March of 2019. They were engaged by August. They married in October of 2019, 25 months after his mother died. That was his timeline to choose, and I respected it. I attended the wedding. I gave a toast. I meant every word. Simone Patton Nate Calloway, 38 years old at the time of this story, grew up in a suburb of Cincinnati, graduated from Miami University, worked in nonprofit development and events management before Daniel's income made that optional rather than necessary. She is smart. She is organized. She is the kind of woman who walks into a room and has a seating chart arranged in her mind before she has taken off her coat. I noticed all of that about her from the beginning. I also noticed from our first dinner together at Daniel's apartment on a Thursday evening in May of 2019 that she had looked at me and arrived at a conclusion, and at the conclusion she had arrived it was not going to be easily revised. She was not unkind to me at first. She was polite in the specific way that people are polite to someone they have assessed as peripheral, attentive enough to demonstrate good manners, not attentive enough to suggest genuine interest. She asked about my work once at that first dinner, and when I said I was a retired structural engineer, she said, "Oh, that must have been interesting," in a tone that indicated she found it neither interesting nor particularly worth pursuing. I said it had been. I passed the bread. We moved on. The pattern established itself slowly over the months and years that followed. I am an engineer. I do not reach conclusions from single data points. I watch for the pattern, and the pattern, taken in aggregate, was this. I was being moved to the edge of my son's life in increments too small to name individually, but perfectly clear once you had collected enough of them. The Tuesday calls that had been a consistent feature of Daniel's and my relationship since Patricia's diagnosis. Calls where we talked for 45 minutes, sometimes an hour, about nothing important, and everything that mattered got shorter, then less frequent. By the spring of 2021, I was hearing from Daniel reliably about once every 10 days, and when I called on the off days, he often could not talk for more than a few minutes. I noticed that he sounded more himself when Simone was out of the house. Not dramatically different, just fractionally more relaxed, the way a building settles slightly when you remove a compressive load. Holidays became occasions I was peripherally included in rather than central to. At Thanksgiving of 2021, I was seated at the far end of the table of 14, between a college friend of Simone's I had never met and a second cousin from Cincinnati who had also never met me and spent most of the meal on his phone. I am not a man who requires a seat of honor, but I am a man who notices where he is placed, because placement tells you something. Placement is data. I kept a yellow legal pad in the kitchen drawer. I noted dates. I noted what was said and what was not said. I noted when Daniel initiated contact and when I had to initiate myself. I noted small things. A Christmas gift that arrived a week late with a gift receipt tucked inside as though I might want to exchange it. A birthday dinner in January of 2022 that Daniel mentioned, after fact, that Simone had been really tired that week and it had not been a good time to organize. I made coffee I didn't particularly need, and I sat at my kitchen table, and I wrote things down, and I thought carefully about what I was actually looking at. What I was looking at, I concluded by early 2022, was a structural problem, not a malicious one, not a consciously executed one. A structural problem in the load distribution of my son's marriage, specifically in the way that Simone's assessment of me had been incorporated into the architecture of their household, quietly and incrementally, until it had become load-bearing. She had decided what I was in Daniel, perhaps without ever choosing it in a single conscious moment, had accommodated that decision. Good men do that sometimes, for marriages they want to protect. It does not make them weak. It makes them human. But it does create a structure with a flaw in it, and flaws in structures do not correct themselves. They deepen. In November of 2022, Daniel called me on a Tuesday evening at 6:14. He said Simone had been asked to chair the annual fundraising gala for the Callaway Community Foundation. The foundation was named for her family, specifically for her father, Raymond Callaway, who had established it formally in 2003 and who sat on its board of directors. The gala was scheduled for March 11, 2023. Daniel said Simone had been working on the planning committee for several months. He said it would mean a lot to her if I came. I said I would be there. What Daniel did not know, and what I had never told him, because it had genuinely never come up in any conversation we had ever had, was that my connection to the Callaway Community Foundation predated Simone's involvement with it by approximately 2 decades. It predated, in fact, the foundation's existence as a formal entity. In 1997, I was 41 years old, running my own structural engineering consultancy out of an office on the east side of Columbus, and I was one of 3 founding members of an organization called the Columbus Community Structural Arts Initiative, a small nonprofit focused on structural assessments and rehabilitation planning for underserved community buildings, churches, school facilities, small civic structures that had been neglected and were quietly deteriorating and whose congregations and communities could not afford the professional assessment they needed. The other 2 founding members were a contractor named Willis Boone and Raymond Callaway, who was at that time a commercial developer with a genuine and non-performative commitment to community reinvestment. Raymond and I had known each other professionally for several years before the initiative. We were not close friends in the social sense. We were the kind of men who respected each other's work and trusted each other's judgment and did not require much beyond that. We built the initiative together over 6 years. It was quiet work, unglamorous work. I spent Saturdays in church basements looking at foundation walls. I wrote reports that went to city offices that sometimes acted on them and sometimes did not. I gave money when we needed it. I gave time when we needed that instead. In 2003, Raymond restructured the initiative into the Callaway Community Foundation, broadening its scope and its fundraising profile. There was a transition agreement. Assets transferred. The founding charter of a new organization, which Raymond drafted with the help of an attorney named Beverly Okafor, whose office was on Morse Road, contained a clause preserving the acknowledgement of the original founding members of its precursor organization. Raymond insisted on that clause personally. I know, because he called me on a Wednesday afternoon in September 2003 and read it to me over the phone and asked if I found it satisfactory. I said it was more than satisfactory. He said good, because he was not willing to build something new on top of something old without crediting the people who built the old thing. Raymond Callaway is a man of that particular generation and formation that still believes a handshake means something, and that institutional memory is worth preserving. I have always respected that about him. Over the following 20 years, I continued to contribute to the foundation, not in a single dramatic sum, in increments, through my firm's charitable giving program, through Patricia's estate when she passed, through my own annual giving, through a specific endowment we established together in 2011 for structural assessment grants to small community organizations that could not otherwise afford them. The cumulative total, as of March 2023, was $2.3 million. My name had been on the foundation's donor wall, in the conference room on Morse Road, since 2004. I had not been to the foundation offices in approximately 4 years. I had no particular reason to think Simone was aware of any of this. She had never asked about it. I had never raised it. It was simply a part of my life that existed in its own quiet compartment, the way many things do when you've been alive long enough to have built more than one of them. Mid-story CTA excluded from count. I drove to the Meridian Club on the evening of March 11th in my 2008 Buick. I parked in the east surface lot. I wore the dark suit Patricia had helped me pick out at a department store on Easton in the fall of 2015. It still fits. I do not see a reason to replace things that still fit. The room was set for approximately 180 guests. Round tables, white linens, small centerpieces with white flowers I could not have named. A podium at the front with the foundation's logo projected on a screen behind it. Registration table at the door, where 2 young women in black handed out place cards from a sorted box. A bar to the left where a bartender, was arranging glasses with the specific focused energy of someone who takes the setup portion of their job seriously. It was a well-organized room. I noticed that immediately. Whoever had planned it with care. The young woman at the registration table, whose name tag read Brianna, found my card without difficulty. Table 14. She handed it to me with a pleasant professional smile. Behind her, on an easel, was a seating chart, a room diagram with tables numbered 1 through 18. Tables 1 through 8 in the front half of the room. Table 9 onward, receding toward the back. Table 14 was in the far back left corner, immediately adjacent to the catering station. I noted this without expression. I thanked Brianna and walked to my seat. I sat down. I looked at the program. It was a clean, well-designed document. Simone's work, almost certainly, or work done under her direct supervision. I had a glass of water, and I read through the evening schedule while the room filled around me. The people at my table were, as it turned out, exactly who Simone had implied they would be: volunteers. 4 of them. 2 young men in their 20s who worked for a local landscaping company that had donated grounds maintenance services. A woman in her early 30s who handled social media for a marketing firm that helped with the foundation's digital outreach. And a woman named Margaret Selby, who was 71 years old, had been a schoolteacher for 34 years, and had known Patricia from a church group they had both attended in the early 2000s. Margaret recognized me the moment I sat down and said, "Gerald, I haven't seen you in years. How are you?" And I said I was well, and it was good to see her, which was entirely true. Simone arrived at the main table, table 1, front center, at 7:03 in the evening. Red dress, hair up, the specific composed energy of a woman who has spent months preparing for a room and intends to own every minute of it. She was good at this. I want to be honest about that. She moved through the pre-dinner reception with efficiency and warmth, working the room in the methodical way of someone who has planned the path in advance. Daniel was with her at the beginning, and then circulating separately, the way couples do at events where one of them is the formal host. Daniel saw me across the room at some point around 7:10 and raised his hand. I raised my glass of water. He gave me a look that I read, with some precision, as apologetic, which told me he had noted the seating assignment and understood something about it. He is a perceptive man when he allows himself to be. At 7:14, Simone made her way toward the back of the room with a woman I did not yet know. I learned her name later. Courtney Marsh, co-chair of the events committee, a lean woman in her early 40s with the quick, efficient mannerisms of someone who had spent the last several months managing logistics. They stopped at table 14. Simone looked at me. She smiled. She said, "Gerald, I'm glad you made it." Then she turned slightly toward Courtney and said, "This is Daniel's father, Gerald." She said the way you say a sentence that is technically complete, but is missing a second half that you have decided not to include. Then she said to me, pleasantly, with her full event chair composure and operation, "We have all the volunteers seated back here. It's actually a really nice spot. You can see the whole room from here." She paused, the smallest pause, and said, "He doesn't always get to these types of events, so—" She let the sentence end there, unfinished. The way people end sentences when the rest of it is something they have decided is safer left implied. Courtney Marsh looked at me with a polite smile. I looked back at her. I said, "Thank you, Simone. It's a beautiful room." She moved on. Something in me went very still. Not anger, not the hot, reactive kind of response that would have been understandable and that I have learned, over 67 years, to be genuinely uninterested in. Something colder and quieter. The specific kind of settled clarity that arrives when a situation that has been accumulating for 3.5 years suddenly resolves itself into a single clean image, the way a structure looks different once you've found the flaw. I sat at table 14. I ate dinner. I had a conversation with Margaret Selby about her grandchildren and about the container tomatoes she had been growing on her apartment balcony, and it was a genuinely good conversation, the kind that reminds you that the main table is rarely where the interesting people are seated. I watched Simone work the room during dinner. I watched her move between tables, lean in close to hear things, laugh at the right moments, touch people on the arm in the specific practiced way of someone skilled at making strangers feel recognized. She was good at it. The room liked her. The room had no reason not to. At 8:15, she went to the podium and gave her remarks. They were well-prepared, confident, specific in a way that indicates genuine familiarity with the material. She thanked the corporate sponsors by name. She thanked the planning committee. She told a brief story about her father's vision for the foundation that was both personal and appropriately restrained for a public setting. She received a warm and deserved applause. I clapped along with the room. Margaret Selby leaned over and said quietly, "She's very polished." I said yes. She is. A video tribute to the foundation's 20-year history followed. Photographs, interview clips with community members whose buildings have been assessed and rehabilitated, brief segments with board members. I watched it. I recognized several of the properties shown in the early photographs because I've been inside some of them in the late 90s, standing in their basements with a flashlight, writing notes on a yellow legal pad about what needed to be done and how urgently. At 8:34, Dr. Curtis Webb stepped to the podium, 63 years old, silver-haired. The particular measure authority that accumulates in people who have run institutional meetings for 2 decades without losing their composure. He thanked the planning committee again. He acknowledged Raymond Calloway at table 2 with a warmth that was clearly genuine and long-standing. He thanked the corporate sponsors whose names were on the printed program. And then he said, "And as we do every year at this dinner, I want to take a moment to honor the names on our founding donor wall. These are the individuals whose early commitment, and in many cases whose sustained commitment over many years, made this foundation what it is today. I'm going to read these names, and if any of them are present in the room this evening, I'd ask you to stand and be recognized." He read them in alphabetical order. There were 11 names. He read them at the measured pace of someone who understands that names deserve to be given the space they have earned. I sat with my hands in my lap. I did not look at the podium. I looked at the centerpiece on the table in front of me. White flowers, small, arranged simply. Gerald A. Patton. I heard the name the way you hear your own name in a circumstance where you were not expecting it, with a fraction of a second of distance, as though it belongs to someone else, and then the immediate closing of that distance. I heard, from somewhere between my table and the front of the room, a sound, not a word, not a gasp, exactly, something involuntary and brief. The sound a person makes when the floor moves under them in a room full of people, and they have approximately 0 seconds to decide how their face should look about it. Dr. Webb looked up from his list. He scanned the room with the unhurried patience of someone accustomed to waiting for responses. He said, "Gerald, are you with us this evening?" I raised my hand, not dramatically, the way you raise your hand when a roll is being called. Dr. Webb found me in the back left corner of the room. His expression, when he located me at table 14, registered something that was not quite surprise, more like a recalibration, the look of a man who is making note of a placement that he finds worth noting. He said, "Wonderful. Ladies and gentlemen, Gerald Patton was one of the 3 founding members of the Columbus Community Structural Arts Initiative, which became the foundation we are all here to support tonight. Gerald, going back to the very beginning, 1997, is that right?" I said, 1997, yes. He said, 26 years. His cumulative commitment to this foundation is $2.3 million, and his name has been on our charter since the day we incorporated. Gerald, we are genuinely grateful for everything you have built with us. The room applauded. I nodded. Margaret Selby put her hand on my arm and said, in a tone of absolute delight, "You didn't say a word." I said, "It didn't come up." She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that startled her, and said, "Gerald Patton, you are something else entirely." I said I didn't think so. She said she did. I did not look at Simone during this. I want to be precise about that because it matters to me that I was not performing anything for her benefit. I looked at Dr. Webb. I acknowledged the room. I took a sip of my water. What I allowed myself, privately, was a single moment of something that was not satisfaction, exactly, more like the specific feeling of watching a structural analysis come out exactly as the numbers said it would. The numbers were always going to say what they said. It was simply a question of when someone read them aloud. What I did look at, briefly, at the moment Dr. Webb moved to the next name on his list, was Raymond Calloway at table 2. Raymond is 71 years old. He had been watching the exchange of the expression of a man who has been waiting for a particular moment for an indeterminate length of time, and is not particularly surprised to see it arrive. He caught my eye. He gave me a small nod, a single, measured nod of the specific kind that men of our generation use to communicate complete sentences without any of the words. I nodded back. I spent another 40 minutes at the reception after the program concluded. I had a genuine and unhurried conversation with Dr. Webb about a building the foundation owned on the Near East Side, for which they were considering a structural renovation. He mentioned that the preliminary drawings had some elements the board wanted a second opinion on. I said I would be glad to look at them. He thanked me and we exchanged cards. We talked for perhaps 15 minutes. It was the kind of conversation I have always found most natural, specific, substantive, about something real. Raymond found me near the bar at approximately 9 o'clock. He shook my hand with both of his. He said, "I wonder when that was going to happen." I said I hadn't planned it. He said he knew that. He said Patricia would have found it hilarious. I told him I had been thinking exactly that. He laughed, and it was a full, genuine laugh. And we stood there for a moment in that specific, comfortable silence that exists between people who have known each other long enough to not need to fill it. Daniel found me near the coat check at 9:52. He had the expression of a man who has been handed a piece of information that reorganizes a significant number of previous assumptions and is still in the process of reorganizing them. He said, "Dad, why didn't you ever tell me?" I said, "You never asked." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Does Simone know?" I said, "She does now." He looked at me with an expression I recognized, the same expression he had at 11 years old when he came to me after failing a math test he had been certain he would pass. The expression of someone who has just understood that their model of the situation was wrong and is now trying to figure out how long it has been wrong and what that means. He said, "I think we need to talk. Really talk." I said, "I think that's right. Not tonight, but soon." He nodded. He hugged me. A long one. The kind that means something specific, not the brief shoulder pat kind. I held on. He is my son. He is a good man who had been making a long series of small accommodating decisions without ever stepping back to see what they added up to. That is a very human thing to do. It does not require anger from me. It requires patience, and patience is something I have in sufficient supply. I drove home at 10:23 through the quiet streets of Columbus, past the Kroger on Morse Road, past the traffic light at Cleveland Avenue that has been cycling wrong for 3 years. I pulled into my driveway on Birchwood Drive and sat in the car for a few minutes without the engine running, looking at the front of the house. The gutters needed cleaning. The driveway crack was still there. The porch light was on because I leave it on when I go out in the evening, a habit from 34 years of being someone Patricia would come home to. I went inside. I made a pot of coffee. I sat at my kitchen table with my yellow legal pad and wrote the date at the top of a fresh page, March 11th, 2023. I sat with that for a while. I thought about Patricia. She would have found the whole thing, the volunteer table, the seating chart, Simone's careful, pleasant condescension, Dr. Webb reading the names, Margaret's laugh. She would have found all of it extraordinarily funny. Not meanly. She was never mean. But she had a gift for locating the precise, tragicomic core of a situation and holding it up to the light. She would have said something in her dry, quiet way, one sentence, perfectly placed, and it would have been a one sentence that resolved the entire story into its simplest possible form. I miss her most in the moments when I know exactly what she would have said and cannot hear her say it. I want to tell you how things settled, because this is not ultimately a story about a dinner. It is a story about a structure and what happens when you finally locate where the load was never properly distributed. In the weeks that followed March 11th, Daniel and I talked more than we had in the preceding 2 years combined. Not about Simone, not directly, not at first. About the pattern, about the calls that had gotten shorter and the visits that had gotten less frequent in the way I had been quietly moved the perimeter of my own son's life in increments that were individually explicable, but collectively told a story that neither of us had named out loud. Daniel listened to all of it without deflecting. He did not make excuses. He said at one point, "I knew something was happening." I think I chose not to look at it directly because looking at it directly would have required me to do something about it, and I didn't want the conflict. He said, "That's not good enough." I said, "No, but it's honest, and honest is the right place to start." He is my son. We start from honest. Simone called me on March 19th at 4:30 in the afternoon. I want to be honest about that call because it does not resolve as cleanly as some people might want. She was not simple about it. She said she had not known about my history with the foundation, which I believed, and that had she known, the evening would have looked different. She did not pretend that her remark about me not understanding these types of events had been nothing. She said, carefully, that she thought she had formed some conclusions about who I was early on and had not revisited them the way she should have. She said she was sorry. I said I appreciated that, and I meant it. What neither of us addressed directly was the 3.5 years behind a single evening. But I did not press it, because I am not a man who needs to press things. The conversation had happened. It had said what it needed to say. What would follow would tell me more than any accounting of the past could. What followed, over the months after that call, was a gradual and imperfect and genuine shift. The invitations became real ones rather than procedural ones. The calls from Daniel became regular again. At Thanksgiving of 2023, Simone asked me to sit at the head of the table. I sat there. I said grace. I was grateful for the food and for the room full of people, and for my son across the table who was looking at me with an expression that said he was glad I was there. I was glad too. Dr. Webb sent the preliminary drawings for the East Side building in early April. I spent 2 afternoons at my drafting table going through them carefully. I found 3 issues in the load-bearing calculations, not catastrophic, not immediately visible, but the kind of thing that compounds over 8 or 10 years until it becomes significantly more expensive to correct than it would have been at the outset. I wrote my notes in a 7-page memo, sent it to Dr. Webb with a cover letter, and billed the foundation for $0. He called to thank me. He said the board was relieved. I said it was not a problem. It was not. My name is still on that donor wall on Morse Road. It will be there after I am gone. I find that neither morbid nor particularly remarkable. It is simply the record of work that was done and money that was given and time that was spent quietly, without fanfare, over 26 years. The record does not require my presence to exist. That is, in my experience, the most reliable kind. Daniel and I have lunch on the first Tuesday of every month at the diner on Broad Street. The coffee is bad in the specific, consistent way that means they've been making it the same way since 1978 and have no intention of changing. We sit there for 2 hours. He tells me about projects. I tell him about the tomatoes, about whatever I'm working on at the bench in the garage, about nothing in particular and everything that matters. It is the best part of my month, without competition. Some things you build slowly and hold quietly and do not require anyone else to acknowledge for them to be real. The structures that last are almost never the ones that announce themselves. They are the ones that were built correctly, from the foundation up, by people who understood load distribution and did not cut corners and showed up on Saturdays when no one was watching. Patience is not weakness. Patience is the methodology of people who intend to still be standing when everyone else has finished making noise. 26 years in April. I would not change a single year of it. If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of Dad's Raw Revenge. I will see you on the next one.